The fighter jet debate has become something like a tug of war between two philosophies that rarely meet on common ground. On one side stand the believers in raw technological supremacy, those who argue that only the most complex, most expensive, most secretive machines can defend a nation. On the other side are the pragmatists, the ones who look at the balance sheet before they look at the brochure. Into this noisy battlefield flies Sweden's Gripen, a jet that disrupts expectations simply by existing. It isn't loud, it isn't flashy, and yet it forces governments to ask questions they would rather avoid. The F-35 is a thunderstorm in the shape of an airplane. It promises stealth that bends radar waves, a helmet that sees through the fuselage, and data fusion that borders on sorcery. Nations that buy it aren't just buying a fighter. They're buying a promise of dominance in the kinds of wars most countries hope never to fight. The catch is that the F-35 is not just a weapon. It is an ecosystem, a lifestyle, a permanent membership in a club where every replacement part, every software update, and every maintenance cycle depends on a vast global machine centered far from home. Gripen comes from a different world entirely. Swedish engineers designed it not for glamour, but for survival. The guiding assumption behind the jet was simple. One day the main bases might be gone, the runways cratered, the logistics chain shattered. So they built a fighter that could land on a frosty stretch of rural highway, refuel, rearm, and take off again in minutes, serviced by a handful of conscripts, with toolkits rather than an army of highly specialized technicians. Instead of needing the environment to be perfect, Gripen was made to thrive in imperfection. This difference becomes sharply visible when a country begins calculating what its air force can actually afford to fly. Buying a jet is the easy part. Flying it for 30 or 40 years is the real test. Gripen behaves like a frugal Scandinavian sedan. Efficient, reliable, inexpensive to maintain. The F-35 behaves like a supercar. Exhilarating, powerful, and thirsty in every sense. A nation that chooses Gripen can afford more flight hours, more training, more readiness. A nation that chooses the F-35 must accept a smaller, more expensive flying force and compensate for the lack of hours with simulation. Pilots often describe the F-35 as a computer with wings, and they mean it as a compliment. The aircraft anticipates, calculates, and stabilizes in ways that seem to defy physics. But there is a cost to this brilliance. It requires climate-controlled hangars, delicate care for its coatings, and a supply chain that cannot falter. Gripen, by contrast, feels like an aircraft as much as a machine, responsive, conventional enough that young pilots can transition quickly, rugged enough that harsh weather is an inconvenience rather than a threat. All of these contrasts become more urgent when applied to Canada, a country where the sky isn't merely big, it is a continent of its own. The Arctic demands aircraft that can sit on a windswept apron at -40 and still start on command. Many of Canada's forward locations have short runways, limited infrastructure, and weather patterns that only respect themselves. In such an environment, the value of an aircraft isn't measured by its stealth profile, but by its reliability, its ease of maintenance, and its ability to generate sorties when the nearest depot is a 3-hour flight away. The economic dimension is equally tangled. Lockheed Martin offers Canada a place in the largest aerospace program on Earth, complete with long-term industrial contracts that tie Canadian companies into a supply chain producing jets for dozens of nations. Saab, on the other hand, offers something more intimate: local assembly, domestic software development, and a degree of industrial sovereignty that large multinational programs rarely allow. One offer ties Canada deeper into American defense infrastructure. The other gives Canada more control, but on a smaller scale. And so Canada finds itself debating not only which fighter it wants, but what kind of military identity it wants to embrace. The F-35 represents alignment with the most technologically dominant military power in history. Gripen represents independence, flexibility, and a logic rooted in geography rather than prestige. The question becomes whether Canada wants the most advanced aircraft on the planet, or the aircraft that will most often be in the sky when something unexpected appears on radar at 2 in the morning somewhere over the Beaufort Sea. What Gripen really challenges is the assumption that the most expensive choice is automatically the most strategic one. It forces decision-makers to confront uncomfortable truths about budgets, readiness, and the difference between hypothetical wars and the daily mission of protecting national airspace. The F-35 is extraordinary. Its capabilities are unmatched. But Gripen whispers a quieter, more strategic message. The best fighter is the one you can afford to fly every day, not the one you can barely keep airborne. Once the accounting department sends its annual warning. In that sense, the Swedish jet doesn't need to win every competition outright. Simply by being a credible alternative, it reshapes the entire conversation. It reminds nations that practicality is not the enemy of modernity, and that smart engineering can sometimes triumph over brute technological force. Gripen is the dragonfly, small, agile, easy to underestimate. The F-35 is the Thunderbird, powerful, intimidating, designed to dominate storms. The real question for any country is simple. Which creature belongs in its sky? If you want, I can also craft a more dramatic version, a shorter one for video narration, or a more analytical version focusing on numbers and doctrine.